The element that laid the foundations for great discoveries. An accidental discovery that was the beginning of a research that continued for nearly 100 years. A Ukrainian researcher who took part in an expedition of the legendary Howard Carter. Nicolai Regional Museum of Local Lore. The foundation of this educational institution was laid by Olvia excavations organized by the first citizen of Mykolaiv, Mikhailo Faleev. The walls and roof were provided by the decision of the first governor of Mykolaiv, Marquis de Travers, and the revival after half a century of idling was an initiative of amateur ethnographer and the first director of the museum, Sergei Haiduchenko. And while the first funds consisted of long-awaited artifacts, today there is a place for random and sometimes even more interesting finds. For example, a 62-centimeter high bronze cauldron with a volume of 37 liters. It was cast and forged. The upper ring and the bottom were cast. But they used an interesting technology inherent to this type of cauldrons. They were assembled with flat slabs. First, flat metal slabs were cast and only then the cauldron was assembled. The cauldron is made of sheet bronze using the rifting technique. It was used over a long period of time, as evidenced by the traces of ancient restoration, meaning the patches on the surface. Worn to the holes, it was a work of art that not everyone could afford several centuries ago. Just any blacksmith couldn't have made it because I believe it was necessary to calculate the diameter of the bottom and the top ring and make it the corresponding height. All these details had to be planned in advance. Experts believe that such products were very expensive and one family could not afford to own them. The cauldron has been mysterious for over half a century and is unique today. The fact is that there are no raw materials for bronze product manufacturing in the territory of our region. For a long time, we had absolutely no idea what the origin of this bronze was. But that's not the only mystery of this simple artifact at the first glance. For many decades, the Mykolaiv find caused equally heated debates among scientists as to the place of its discovery. This all began in August of 1927. The thing is that the land of Mykolaiv got lucky in those years, in the first half of the 20th century, because Feodosy Kaminsky lived in the city, a unique person with a very difficult yet a fascinating destiny. According to archival data, he even took part in an expedition of the famous Carter, who unearthed the tomb of Tutankhamen. But that was later, and Kaminsky was part of his expedition in the 10s, before the revolution. That is, he took part in the expedition as a young man. He was interested in archaeology prior to that. And when he returned to Mykolaiv, he started researching and gathering ancient information on the territory of the Mykolaiv Peninsula. By that time, the excavations of one of the most prominent settlements with international history, Olvia, had already been in full swing in the territory of the present-day Mykolaiv Oblast. This is one of the largest and most interesting ancient settlements in the territory of modern Ukraine, which was founded in the 6th century BC by people from Millet, which is the modern-day territory of Turkey. That's exactly when the great relocations of people began in Greece in the 7th century BC, when the Greeks sailed to our territories to explore these lands, and some of them stayed and founded a city here. The first, albeit fragmentary, exploration of Volvia began in the 18th century AD, but in those times Musin Pushkins, the owners of the territory on which the remains of the ancient city were found, did not give permission to archaeologists to conduct excavations. To be more accurate, Boris Farmakovsky began studying the history of Volvia at the turn of the 20th century in 1902. The study of archaeological objects was conducted according to a certain methodology of those times. Those were exclusively small survey expeditions. Back then, this territory was called the Stretch of 100 Graves, because mainly only burial mounds were visible here. The scientists of the expedition team believed that there was some kind of settlement here, but they could not determine what kind of settlement it was at the time. But when systematic excavations began, the first archaeological materials were found. In particular, these were coins bearing the name Olvia, which was the name of the ancient city. Since that moment, Olvia became another El Dorado that attracted scientists from all over the world. However, unlike the mythical South American country, the Greek settlement in Ukraine was real, but it also held treasures. Russian researchers were the first to dig there, and they took all the ancient artifacts they found to the Hermitage. By the mid-1920s, several ancient settlements were found on the territory of Mykolaiv itself. It was these ancient objects that the director of the Mykolaiv Regional Museum of Local Lore, Feodosy Kaminsky, set out for on an expedition with his colleagues in August of 1927. After a great summer rain, they walked along the left bank of the Inhul River. Their presumption that there was an ancient settlement there turned out to be a true discovery of a historic cultural layer. That is, they managed to find fragments of ceramics, bones, and stone crafts. This gave them a very good reason to substantiate and record in their research archives the discovery of a new archaeological site. He found pottery that wasn't ancient, but belonged to the so-called pre-Scythian period, or to the times before the Bronze Age, as it was believed back then. So he pointed out that a new archaeological site had been discovered on the territory of the city. That is, he did not find any unique constructions, though he did find some ceramic works, and later on he was fortunate enough to find several more bronze objects. By and large, research started from these first accidental finds. By traditions, archaeological monuments were named the same as the settlements where the first artifacts were found. But since there had already been Mykolaiv I, Mykolaiv II, and Mykolaiv III, these were ancient objects, he decided to name this object Diki Sad, or Wild Garden, from the name of the tract when it was located. In August 1927, he wrote in his diaries and in their archive that a new settlement of the late Bronze Age had been found, and he called it Wild Garden. That is basically where the history of his research began in 1927. But in the 1920s, they were unable to give special attention to this monument due to lack of financing or for some other reasons. However, some official bodies paid excessive attention to the director of the institution. In September 1929, the NKVD arrested Feodosy Kaminsky on charges of involvement in the Ukrainian Liberation Union and sentenced him to 5 years in concentration camps in Siberia. Before he was convicted, he instructed the Voskoboynikov family, and they had a group called Friends of the Museum, to watch over the Wild Garden, although no excavations or research were conducted. The find of the bronze cauldron, which is a highlight of the Mykolaiv Regional Museum of Local Lore, seems even stranger.
Находка, которая в свое время сделана была случайно.
The find that was an accident at the time in 1930, according to one theory, and in 1931 according to another theory. But why an accident? Because the museum staff had been walking the places where ancient settlements once existed, and one of them literally stumbled upon the handle of the cauldron, which was right on the surface of the earth. They started digging it up, pulled the cauldron out of the ground, and physically dragged it to the museum. The find was named a Sumerian-type cauldron. It still has the same name on its Ukrainian Wikipedia page, although the year of the find is wrong. Within the walls of the Mykolaiv Archaeological Museum of those times, the cauldron occupies a place among ship models, collections of weapons, clothing, metals, and archaeological finds from Kerch, Feodosia, and Olvia, which ended up there earlier. Seeing as the museum did not find systematic exploration of Olvia in the 20th century, artifacts from Olvia and finds like the cauldron were true treasures for the museum. After all, the exhibits became highly politicized, which reduced their scientific and aesthetic value. And at the beginning of the Second World War, the exhibits of the museum were threatened by mortal danger. The museum was almost completely destroyed. Its exposition, however, continued functioning through the occupation period. The museum worked according to that schedule until 3 p.m. There was a curfew. Naturally, most of the visitors were German officers. The townspeople didn't go there that often, as the times were tough and they had other problems to deal with. I must say that part of the museum collection, primarily the findings from the Greek city of Olvia, were taken to Königsberg for an exhibition by the German occupation authorities in the autumn of 1943. They ended up in German museums after that. We're taking part in a program for the return of those rarities, but unfortunately it has been unsuccessful so far, since the inventory books that contained entries of the museum objects of the pre-war period were burned in a fire. Whether the cauldron just didn't draw the attention of the Germans, or it was for some other reason, it remained within the walls of the Mykolaiv Museum and was exhibited through the entire occupation period from August 1941 to March 1944, though this story has not been fully researched. Watch in the next episode. Wrong conclusions were drawn at the time. It was written that it was an object from the Bronze Age of the so-called Sabbatin culture, but since it was within the confines of the city, there was no need to pay attention to it. Similar objects were well known in the steppe regions of Ukraine. The south of Ukraine is traditionally about ancient archaeology. Berezan, Olvia, Chora of Olvia. Slavin was a specialist in ancient times, not in the Bronze Age, so they conducted research and came to the conclusion that there was no point in excavations, especially since there was no access to the site. There was a military unit there, surrounded by barbed wire fence and guards. It is an assumption, of course, probably a daring one, but if it was not used every day and treated with special respect, being passed down from generation to generation, the object could obviously be of high value for many years to come.